Hi everyone. Today we will not be talking about inferior SE, even though the elephant in the room, right? A quintessential example of inferior SE, you might say, but in fact, this is an accident that happened in the course of the day and I'm quite innocent. Please let it not distract you too much. We're going to talk about the pathologizing of the INFJ personality and of the NI function, particularly in a dominant position here. In a very preliminary fashion and in a kind of informal discursive fashion, because it's when you're dealing with questions like these, if you're not an authorized qualified therapist or psychologist, you ought to kind of give a little bit of a disclaimer. And since that's my case, I want to give that disclaimer. I just want to share some thought following a comment by a subscriber that echoes previous comments by subscribers. There is quite a bit of interest on the part of my subscribers, so I imagine the NI community in general in understanding. You see, there's a difference between like the relationship between NI and mental illness. I made a video on this topic recently. I direct you to it. It's a video that's doing well, so probably good. You should check it out, NI and mental illness, on my channel. But that's different from, that's assuming that there is mental illness. And in it, I argue, roughly speaking, that one of the dangers of being an NI dominant and having mental illness is that sometimes an INFJ, say, may develop like a very strong attachment to the worldview that emerges out of the mental illness and become, in a sense, develop mechanisms of survival within the mental illness, which is obviously a tricky thing. But when it comes to the pathologizing, here we're talking about the idea that there may be INFJs and INTJs in particular who are not suffering from anything specific. The only thing that they might suffer from is the strangeness that comes from the words of NI if they do not repress it, if they're not adaptive submissive types, if they're solipsistic types or liberated types of INFJ or INTJ. It's a real question whether there might be a risk of the INFJ difficulty, the strong NI user's difficulty with adapting to or integrating into society, contemporary society, for instance, and speaking the language they do. Might that not lead to them being misunderstood as suffering from some kind of pathology? I think that's the question of our subscriber and of previous subscribers before. So like I said, I want to share some thoughts and not lecture, not do more than just share some thoughts, and based on my experience and the experience of people who have talked to me over the years. So one thing that I think is obvious is that there has been a pathologizing and even a criminalizing of NI discourse at various points in history. I'm sometimes fond of saying that there have also been times when the status of being an INFJ was more valued in society than it is now. Times when there were prophets, times when there were seers, times when there were people who exercised, prediction in their discourse, and they were not looked at as if they were strange people, and they were recognized and valued in society. Equally, it's undeniable that throughout the ages, there's also been strong urge toward enforcing conformity, and a very strong persecution of heterodox discourses. Mystics have been burnt at the stake, witches too. A lot of seers and people who spoke a metaphorical language that was not fitting the particular zeitgeist at the time, they were criminalized and persecuted. And there's no doubt that among them there must have been many INFJs and probably some INTJs as well. Of course, I would be a little bit more hesitant to enter into the detail of how this is taking place today, because you could actually make a case that today the the risk of excessive pathologizing is endemic and is widespread and reaches far beyond the population of INFJs. You could be a person of any type, and that could happen to you. But that doesn't change the fact that there is probably an INFJ, and this is something that I always insist on in The Infinite Soul, which is my new book, by the way, if you want to get my new book, on being an INFJ in the modern world, what life choices to make to lead a fruitful, rich and meaningful life. You can get the book right below. And it's prequel, The Ecstatic Soul, which you might be familiar with. It looks more at INFJ consciousness, and it's the existential constitution. Sold very well, very good reviews. You should check it out. In any case, I always talk about, like in The Infinite Soul, but also in the Ecstatic Soul, I like to talk about the fact that, INFJs, when they do not opt for adaptive submission, they are going to come across as strange at some level, or as different. And that when you're living in the modern world, you face the difficulties and the challenges of the modern world. And one of the challenges of the modern world is it tends to label everything in a slightly more sort of erudite language. You could say it hypostatizes everything, turns everything into a thing. So there's like a million different types of identities now. This happens all over the place, all over the board. And so INFJs, there's going to be a specific INFJ way of experiencing that, in the same way there's going to be a specifically ISFP way of experiencing that. But for the INFJ experience, it's going to take place through probably the words of NI. It's certainly possible that despite your insistence that you're not going to find satisfaction in conforming to the way the world is economically, socially, and so on, and that you need something different. It's possible that even a counselor could, in some sense, pathologize you, or at least try to take you away from that toward the viewpoint that you would be experienced by yourself as being in violation of your NI worldview. And it can be, I think, a distressing experience, because then, if even your psychologist or your counselor does not seem to understand you, what you're going to do. Often the best strategy is usually to move on to switch to another counselor who will understand you. But sometimes people can be so dispirited that they just give up altogether, and they can find themselves very lonely and more misunderstood than ever. And often the path that follows from that is either moving into the solipsistic frame of mind for the INFJ, or falling back into the solipsistic frame of mind. Because it's, in a sense, that's the comfort zone. It's the most natural state for an INFJ to be in. And that, in turn, will increase the risk of being further pathologized. At least that's my view. So that's for my observations, but I would be curious to have your observations as well. This is an ongoing conversation. I'm only exploring this topic, and I'm trying to do it with caution. I have a Patreon page, which is linked below as well. Helps massively to get support from you to keep this channel going. If you like my content, and if you like to provide even a tiny amount of support to help me keep going, please consider it. The link is below. You can interact with me and other things. Okay, see you soon, guys. Bye-bye.